This is the Content Marketing Podcast, episode number 230, Eye-Opening Research on Podcasting in 2017. Hello and welcome to the Content Marketing Podcast. This is the show where we help you grow your tribe and your bottom line through insanely good content. I'm your host, Rachel Parker of Resonance Content Marketing, and today is June 8th, 2017. Hello, or as we say in Texas, howdy, and thank you for joining us for today's episode of the Content Marketing Podcast. Just a reminder, this podcast is available on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play Music, so if you like what you hear, please feel free to click on over and subscribe. I also invite you to download our complimentary ebook, B2B Marketing, from the blog to the bottom line. Download today to learn how to tap into the power of content to drive engagement at each stage of the B2B sales process. To snag your free copy, go to contentmarketinggift.com. Last week, we had a special guest here on the podcast. Josh Hainum of Interact stopped by to chat about why quizzes deserve a prominent place in your content marketing mix. If you happen to miss that episode, feel free to check it out on iTunes or via the RSS feed or on the website at resonancecontent.com/podcast. Today, we are talking about some eye-opening new research about podcasting in 2017, specifically about who is listening and what their listening practices are. This is really special research, and I cannot wait to share it with you. But first, it's time to check in with our news feed for this week's rundown of news you can use. If you've been listening to us recently, you will be thoroughly familiar with the ongoing arms race between Snapchat and Instagram stories. They've been one-upping each other. Almost every episode, we have something to report from one side or the other. So today we have news out of Snapchat. According to an article in Adweek, Snapchat has introduced a new web tool that makes it easier for users to create on-demand geofilters. Now, if you're not familiar with geofilters, those are the filters that come up, like say if you go to a big event or a big convention, or if you are, let's say at Mardi Gras, you might find if you go to upload a snap, you might find one of those filters that say Mardi Gras New Orleans 2017 or something fancy with some fancy graphics. So previously, if a brand wanted to create a geofilter, they had to create custom graphics in Photoshop or Illustrator. So basically, you had to have a professional designer create that for you. Well, now we can choose from pre-designed templates for special events like birthdays, weddings, prom, business events, food and bars, love, celebrations, and graduations. Users can access these pre-designed templates and then modify their text, colors, and graphics to create their own custom geofilter. Now, geofilters are not free, but pricing depends on the size of the area they're going to cover and the length of time they will be available. So if you want to access the new tool, I will give you the URL in the blog post for this episode. Just go to resonancecontent.com/podcast, click on this episode, and you will find the URL there. It's a little long for me to share here, so I will make sure that you get that. Okay, interesting news out of Facebook. An article from the Next Web reports that Facebook is supposedly testing a feature that would allow groups to create online courses for their members. Now, Facebook has not yet officially announced this feature. This is just kind of the rumor that is circulating. So if this is true, this would be Facebook's bid to compete with online learning sites like Udemy and Udacity. And as content marketers, this could be a very interesting opportunity for us because this would give us the chance to offer online learning within the Facebook platform. So we can offer courses without having to send people to a different site. It could be right there on Facebook. Now, the details are still sketchy. Like I said, Facebook has not officially announced it yet, but we will, of course, keep you posted. Okay, our content hit of the week is a post titled, How to Create Tons of Good Content. Make Yourself a Content Lord of the Rings by Jonathan Krantz on the Marketing Profs website. So the title of this post immediately grabbed my attention as many of you know, I am a huge Lord of the Rings geek. Now, the post actually has nothing to do with Tolkien's trilogy, but it does offer an interesting perspective on how small teams can create a steady stream of quality content, which I know for a lot of you is a challenge that you're dealing with right now. So what Jonathan suggests in this post is organizing your content creation around 3 rings, like the rings in the trunk of a tree. So the inner ring is your core content producers. The middle ring is your internal subject matter experts, and the outside ring is your external content creators. And he goes on to offer advice about how to divide and conquer your content workload among these 3 rings of contributors. Very interesting perspective, and I will, of course, share a link in the blog post for this episode at resonancecontent.com/podcast. That is it for this week's update. If you stumble across something you think might be of interest to your fellow content marketers, please tweet it to me at @RachParker so that we can share. Now it's time for this week's Spotlight segment, Eye-Opening Research on Podcasting in 2017. Earlier this year, Edison Research conducted a national telephone survey of 2,000 people in the United States, aged 12 and older, to ask them about podcasting, about whether they're aware of podcasts, whether they listen to podcasts, if so, what are their podcast listening practices and preferences, and it yielded some very interesting results. So I'm looking forward to sharing these with you. By the way, just by way of background, this is part of a series by Edison Research that has been covering a wide range of digital media topics since 1998. And some of their historical data specific to podcasting goes as far back as 2006. And it's really interesting to see how those trends have changed. I will also give you a link to download this report if you want to see the full report. I will provide that in the blog post for this episode over at resonancecontent.com/podcast. Okay, the first thing that they asked was about whether or not people are familiar with podcasting. They just simply asked, are you familiar with the term podcasting? 60% said yes. So more than half are familiar with podcasting. And only 2 years ago, in 2015, that number was only 40%. And back in 2006, that number was 22%. So we've seen, if you look at the chart for this question, you've seen this steady uptick of awareness of podcasting. So the next question, or the next couple of questions, have to do with people's exposure to podcasts, whether they have listened to podcasts. So 40% of the respondents said they have listened to a podcast, so they have at any time listened to a podcast. Yes, I have listened to a podcast at some point. And that is up from 36% in 2016. This is interesting. 24% said they have listened to a podcast in the last month. Folks, that is nearly 1/4 of the American population that has listened to a podcast just in the last month. That is nothing to sneeze at. So as we're seeing here, and I'm going to share more outcomes with you that will hold up this point, that podcast is no longer a little tiny niche of people. It is getting into the mainstream. More than 1/4 of people said they have listened to a podcast in the last month. So of those folks who say they listen to podcasts, specifically among monthly podcast listeners, people who say they listen to podcasts monthly, got some interesting demographics to share about those folks. 56% are male of those monthly podcast listeners, and 44% are female. That kind of surprised me. I don't know why. I tend to think of podcasting as a girl thing, but maybe because I'm a girl and I do it. But lo and behold, the majority, or a slight majority, of those monthly podcast listeners are male. Whatever that may mean to you and your brand, I will leave that up to you. The age distribution is also interesting. The largest group of monthly podcast listeners is the age 18 to 34 group. So that's going to be your millennials and your Gen Z. That is 44%. And then the next largest group is age 35 to 54, 33%. So 1/3 of those monthly podcast listeners are age 35 to 54, which is, for many of us, is a prime target audience, because those are the folks with on the B2C side who have disposable income to spend on consumer products. And on the B2B side, they're more likely to be in decision-making positions. So a very key outcome in terms of the age group of those podcast listeners. Again, 44% in the 18 to 34 group, 33% in the 35 to 54 group. Okay, let's move on to income level. Yes, they got very detailed, and they asked those respondents about their income level. 45% of podcast consumers have a household income of $75,000 or more, and 16% have a household income of $150,000 or more. So these are folks who have achieved a certain level of income. Again, very important on both the B2B and B2C side. Finally, education. 30% of monthly podcast consumers have some graduate or advanced degree. So nearly 1/3 have gone beyond the 4-year college degree and have some kind of graduate degree, whether that's an MBA or other advanced degree. Very, very interesting. And then 27% have 4-year college degrees. So to sum up these demographics, we are looking at an audience of monthly podcast listeners who, number one, are grown-ups. So it's not, it's not 16-year-olds. These are grown-ups who are educated and who have money. If this sounds like the kind of people you might want to spend some time with on a regular basis, then it might be time for you to look into podcasting for your brand. So those are the monthly podcast listeners. Then Edison went on to get into a little more detail among weekly podcast listeners. So these are those respondents who said they had listened to a podcast in the past week, and that was 15% of the respondents. So if you apply that to the larger American population, that comes out to 42 million people. So if you think 42 million people have listened to a podcast in the past week, that is substantial. And that is up from 13% last year and just 10% in 2015. So larger and larger population is saying they have listened to a podcast in the last week, which would say that we would call those weekly podcast listeners, right? So among those weekly listeners, let's look at the time that they spend listening to podcasts. 36% spent 1 to 3 hours in that past week listening to podcasts, and 22% spent 3 to 5 hours listening to podcasts. I don't mean to get clickbaity here, but that really did blow my mind. Okay. If I had seen this behind a clickbait headline that said, "This will blow your mind," it really did. Oh my gosh, 1 to 3 hours, 36%, 22%, 3 to 5 hours, nearly a quarter spend 3 to 5 hours a week listening to podcasts. How many podcasts do they listen to? Well, weekly listeners said they listen to an average of 5 podcasts per week and said they subscribe to an average of 6 podcasts. So this isn't just 1 or 2 podcasts. This isn't just the NPR folks getting the lion's share. They're pretty diverse. They're listening to an average of 5 per week and have subscribed to an average of 6. And I would be willing to bet that the podcast, that they listen to and that they subscribe to, I'd be willing to bet it's pretty diverse range. Maybe there's some personal interest in there. There might be some business interest in there. I'd be willing to bet it's probably a good mix. So very telling outcomes in terms of those weekly listeners and their habits and their preferences. So when people listen to podcasts, this will be the final insight I'm going to share with you. How much do they listen to? How much of any given episode do they tend to listen to? 42% said they typically listen to the entire podcast episode when they do listen, and 44% said they listen to most of the podcast. So, as I said, folks, this is pretty groundbreaking. This is not a tiny, tiny niche audience that we're talking about anymore. We're talking about a substantial number of people. They're listening. They are listening a lot. They're listening to more than one podcast. They are putting in the time. They tend to listen to, the majority tend to listen to either most of or the entire podcast. Now, have I said anything in the last 10 minutes that make you say, oh, no, podcasting's not worth the effort? I see huge opportunity here. The podcast audience is growing. The average podcast listener is an educated adult with high income, and they listen a lot. They listen to a lot of podcasts. They put a lot of time into their podcast listening. They tend to listen all the way through. So my question for you is, and this is something to ponder with your team this week, what are you going to do with this opportunity? Are you going to continue to put off podcasting saying, oh, we don't know. We don't know for sure if it's effective. We don't know if there's an audience. What are you going to do with it? And I'll talk more about this once we get to the tip of the week. So those are the insights that I'm pleased to share from this Edison Research. By the way, Edison, highly, highly reputable research firm. I totally trust what I hear from them. From their report on the podcast listener audience in 2017. Again, if you would like to download a free copy of this report, I will provide a link in the blog post for this episode at resonancecontent.com/podcast. If you have any questions about what I just shared, or if you'd like to add to the conversation about your own podcasting success story, I would love to hear from you. Feel free to tweet me at @RachParker. And of course, you can always reach me through the website, resonancecontent.com. Now it's time for our content marketing tip of the week. Speaking of podcasting, I want to look back a couple of weeks on this podcast to when we talked about the 2017 Social Media Marketing Industry Report from Social Media Examiner. We shared some of their results with you a couple of weeks ago. By the way, if you happen to miss that episode, you can check it out at resonancecontent.com/podcast. And I believe it's number 227, 228, something like that. And one thing that we reported in the results from this survey is that the study revealed that only 8% of marketers are using podcasting. 8% of all marketers are using podcasting. And 60% have no plans, no interest in getting involved in podcasting, like ever, ever, ever. Okay, so given what I just shared with you from Edison's research about the podcast market, I don't know, folks, is it me or is there a huge disconnect between the opportunities out there and the number of marketers that are willing to take advantage of them? And I don't know what the hurdle is. Excuse me. You know, you talk to brands about video, say, yeah, we're all over video. We're on YouTube, we're on Facebook, we're on Facebook Live, blah, blah, blah. And then ask about podcasting and hear crickets. But I've just shared with you that the audience is there and they are hungry for that audio content. So my tip for you this week is if you have the slightest inkling of an interest in exploring podcast organization, now's the time. Get your resources in place and get it going. And here's one valuable piece of advice that I want to share with you. It doesn't have to be forever, okay? If you have an interest and you believe you have an audience, give it a year. Okay, commit to podcasting for 1 year and then decide if you want to continue. That will give you a good year's worth of data. You can see if it's working for you. And if you walk away from it, then at least you gave it a try. Because, folks, the opportunity is there and it might not be there forever. Maybe someone will, quote, discover podcasting and then it's going to be a big pylon. And then the blue ocean is going to turn red as the sharks start feeding. So if you've been considering podcasting, jump on in, give it your best shot, and start tapping into this tremendous opportunity that is out there available to you today. Okay, campers, that's it for me today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Content Marketing Podcast. If you like what you've heard, please feel free to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play Music or via our RSS feed. And if you really like what you've heard, please leave us a quick review on iTunes. I would so appreciate it. Also, if you want to learn more about content marketing, you will definitely want to grab a copy of my book, The Content Marketing Coach, Everything You Need to Get in the Game and Win. That is available in book and Kindle format. To learn more about the book and to download a free chapter, visit contentmarketingcoachbook.com. You know, just this week, I published a blog post about what Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address can teach us about content marketing. And what brought that about is I just finished watching Ken Burns' documentary, The Civil War. So I've kind of had Lincoln on the brain. So today I want to share Today I want to share a quote with you from Abraham Lincoln. And this is one of my favorite quotes of all time. He once said, "Give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I will spend the first 4 sharpening the axe." Unquote. Again, this is Rachel Parker with Resonance Content Marketing. Thank you again for listening, and we will see you again next week. Take care.